Hey everybody, this is Matt Perky, and this is Wilmington Weekly. I know I've said this in a few episodes now, but the workshop matters. If you only watch the regular meeting, you see the votes and the readings. What you miss is most of the explanation and a lot of the framing that happens before the vote ever arrives. So tonight I want to walk through March 19th the way it actually happened. The workshop at 6 did most of the heavy lifting. The regular meeting at 7 mostly formalized it. Let's start there. The workshop opened with a presentation from Kristen Ondalik of Swindler & Sons Florist about the 2026 Downtown Flower Program. This year's proposal is a little bigger, and part of that is tied to Wilmington's celebration of America's 250th anniversary. She said the goal was a more cohesive downtown display, building on what they started last year. The planning season would run from about May 20 into October and include about 50 total hanging baskets. The real issue was labor. Last year, the watering estimate came in too low, and Kristen said that the actual time was closer to 30 to 32 hours a week. This year's proposal increases that estimate and includes a more flexible billing approach so the city would not overpay when less labor is needed. Mayor Haley made it clear that he wanted Swindler & Sons to handle the watering again. The basic reason was simple. It took a significant burden off city staff last year. Auditor Vance added an important budget point. The line that covers flowers also covers the July fireworks, so if council wants to move forward at this higher cost, it likely will require a supplemental appropriation. That flower discussion may sound small, but it shows a pretty familiar local government pattern. The question was not whether people like the idea, the question was where the labor falls, who does it better, and how to pay for it cleanly. After that, the workshop moved into city services. Service Director Crow walked through two infrastructure items, Curtis Drive and North Spring Street, Phase 1. Curtis Drive is a full reconstruction project. Crow said the city secured a grant and already has the local match in the budget. North Spring Street is being approached in phases. Phase 1 is focused on underground utility work, and the city plans to pursue additional grant support later for the surface improvements. There were essentially no council questions on either one. That became a theme. The workshop explanation happened, then the regular meeting later that night mostly formalized it. The finance portion of the workshop had a few useful teaching moments. Council discussed the city match for new ODOT transit vehicles, 2 new police cruisers, and a set of routine finance items that mostly come down to how money moves through the budget. Chief Gibson said the new cruisers will replace a 2016 and a 2019 Dodge Charger. Those older cars will then move into training use for driver training, and 2 older vehicles will be then handed down to fire department for their training. That is a useful reminder that vehicle replacement is not always one step. A patrol car can live one life out on the road and a second life in training before it's finally done. Auditor Vance also clarified why some transfers come to council and others do not. Money can move internally a lot of ways, but once it moves into a capital line, council approval is required. Council also handled a routine then and now item, which I've explained in recent episodes, so I'll leave that there. The more important finance discussion involved landfill notes. Auditor Vance walked through the city's strategy of using short-term notes for medium-sized capital needs, paying part down each year, and reissuing the balance as needed. And here's why that's important. Buried inside that explanation was a point that feeds directly into the recycling discussion. If the city wanted to, there appears to be a financing path for a recycling truck through that broader landfill note structure. Cell 9, the current landfill cell, is expected to last 5 years. The current payoff path sounded closer to 3. That does not answer every question, but it does mean the truck is not obviously impossible in the way some later discussion made it sound. I need to pause here and connect this to last week. Last week, I recorded a special episode, episode 10, on the March 9th Public Works Committee meeting, because recycling and fluoride were moving fast enough to deserve a closer look. What happened in this workshop added to that discussion and showed even more clearly how the issue is being framed. Tolliver asked Crow to give an overview of the curbside recycling program, theatrically apologized for putting him on the spot, and Crow was clearly ready for the ask with typed remarks in hand. It quickly became the sharpest discussion of the night. Crow's case focused on cost, contamination, route length, staffing, equipment. He said the city is, in his words, bleeding pretty good. And he said the city has to get serious if it wants to continue the program. He talked contamination, how hard it is to catch with automated pickup, and how difficult it is to police the stream once the truck is dumping automatically. He also raised rental properties as a concern, suggesting renters are harder to retrain and less likely to take ownership of the process. No data was presented for that claim in the room. What stood out was not just the substance, it was the structure of the conversation. This did not feel like a workshop where the city came in with a menu of options and asked council to weigh them. It felt like staff came in with a prepared case for why curbside recycling should end. A rear-load manual truck was brushed aside as too labor-intensive. Bi-weekly pickup was brushed aside as likely to create overflowing carts and litter. A subscription charge had not been developed into a serious proposal. And when Wells asked the obvious question about how other cities handle recycling, Crow did not really have a developed comparative answer. There was also a tension inside Crow's own argument. At one point, he minimized the program by saying it diverts only about a ton a day, that a full year of recycling equals about 1 day of landfill content. But when biweekly pickup was discussed, he warned that carts would overflow and create litter. Those points do not fit together especially well. If the recycling stream is too minor to justify the service, it's hard to turn around and argue that less frequent pickup would immediately create a visible overflow problem. If the city is going to argue that curbside recycling no longer works, then the public should hear not just the problems, but the alternatives that were seriously considered and then rejected. The city asked for public input, got statistically meaningful local input, and then when that input did not naturally support elimination, the conversation shifted toward why the survey should not carry much weight. That is a serious move in a public process. Once the city asks for input, gets a solid response, and then starts minimizing that response because it points the wrong direction, the burden should shift back to the city. If staff wants to move forward, ending the service anyway, then staff should have to show clearly why the survey wasn't enough, which alternatives were tested, and why those alternatives failed. At the same time, Knowles walked through a rough cost frame and annualized the truck and program expenses across about 5,100 residences. That framing made the number sound large, but it also left out a simpler way to understand it. Spread monthly across the customer base, the number lands very differently. The weakest part of Crow's case was the environmental argument. At one point, he said that when you look at the tires, diesel fuel, DEF fluid, the truck's own carbon footprint, that the city may not really be helping the environment by diverting what he described as a relatively small amount of waste. That is a very large claim, and nothing presented in the workshop came close to establishing it. If the city wants to argue that curbside recycling is too expensive, that's a financial argument. If the city wants to argue that contamination is too high, that's an operational argument. But once the city starts arguing the environmental value of recycling is effectively canceled out by the truck itself, it has moved into a very different kind of claim, and one that was not supported with actual analysis that night. It also discounts resident feedback while trying to recast recycling itself as less valuable than many residents appear to believe it is. So, to me, the workshop did not make the case that curbside recycling is impossible. It made the case that the staff doesn't want to keep doing it under the current model. And those are not the same thing. After the workshop ended, council reconvened for the regular meeting at 7. The meeting opened in the usual way, then moved into a public hearing on a zoning text amendment dealing with minor subdivision review committee. This was basically a cleanup item. Service Director Crow explained that the 2024 code update had accidentally removed the definition, and this legislation restores it. The mayor did ask how minor is defined, and Crow walked through the criteria, and the public hearing closed with no comment. Public comment was more substantive. 3 speakers urged Wilmington to renew and reaffirm its support for Merefa, Ukraine, Wilmington's sister city. They pointed to the war, the community's ongoing humanitarian support, and the deeper symbolism of standing by a city fighting for its own independence. Another speaker raised concerns about homelessness and referenced the book Rough Sleepers in discussing how unhoused people are treated and perceived. Another speaker on the downtown parking issue made a useful point. If beautification is really the goal, then vacant or underused downtown buildings probably matter more than the parking signs themselves. Mayor Haley then used his report for an extended tribute to Captain Curtis Angst, the local airman killed in a recent conflict in Iran. Then came one of the stranger moments of the meeting. Service Director Crow opened his remarks by saying, "This was not on the agenda. This is just something I'd like to ask council to consider." He then made a historical argument for opening council meetings with prayer and suggested that council consider inviting local pastors or otherwise incorporating a moment of prayer instead of relying only on the current moment of silence. A few things are worth noting here. First, Crow himself acknowledged that it was not on the agenda. Second, this was not framed as solving a city operations problem. Third, it was a proposal touching religion in an official meeting setting, introduced without public notice on the agenda. Council did not act on it that night. President Osborne simply said they would take it under consideration. I'll be interested to see whether law department or council addresses that more directly going forward. Safety Director Eveland then gave 2 reports that matter as well. The first involved the tornado siren system. He said the sirens are aging, not all of them worked properly during the last test, and that the city needs to figure out how the system can be improved. That is one of those infrastructure issues that feels invisible until it does not work. Then, suddenly, it becomes urgent. The second involved fire staffing and department structure. Evelyn said the current fire department ordinance has not really been updated since 2008 and no longer reflects how the department actually operates. The old structure assumed volunteers and intermittents. The city apparently cannot recruit enough of those anymore. He laid out the broad direction the administration wants to discuss. Keep a chief, an assistant chief, eliminate the deputy chief position, move away from the volunteer model, and increase the number of full-time firefighters. What stood out there was not the policy debate itself, it was the process debate. The room spent a lot of time talking about how to schedule the conversation, whether a committee meeting should be used, and what would have to appear on the agenda. Old Business then brought up the second reading of the downtown parking sign ordinance. This part of the meeting was messy, and it's important to get the record straight. The city is not removing downtown parking limits. The city is consolidating and replacing signs. That means that the underlying 2-hour and 4-hour restrictions will stay in place, but the city wants fewer signs and cleaner placement to reduce the visual clutter downtown. The discussion got muddled because several people kept sliding between 3 different questions. 1, do the existing parking limits still exist? 2, are they actively enforced every day? And 3, should there be flexibility during downtown major events? Those are not the same question. At one point, the mayor suggested he did not understand the point of leaving signs up if the city is not actively enforcing them all the time. That was the wrong frame. Chief Gibson later clarified the actual situation very well. The city does not actively patrol downtown timed parking day to day, but the police still respond to complaints. They do not chalk tires anymore, but they can mark the ground and follow up. In other words, the current system is complaint-driven enforcement, but not no enforcement. The signs preserve the city's ability to enforce when a problem arises. Without them, there is nothing to enforce. So this ordinance is mostly cosmetic. It cleans up the look of downtown while preserving the legal ability to act if parking becomes a real issue. That's the clean record, even though the meeting itself made it harder than it needed to be. The ordinance received a second reading and will come back for a third on April 2nd. Judiciary then took up the third reading of the East End Elementary Purchase Resolution. I have to give Snar credit here because he asked the obvious question. What is the city planning to do with East End? The mayor's answer was basically that there is no defined use yet. The city wants to acquire it first, then get suggestions from the community. That answer alone should tell people something. Council is being asked to approve the purchase before the city had really articulated a public plan for the site. Then Crow described the building as, quote, structurally sound, but the meeting never established whether that conclusion came from a formal inspection, a written report, or simply staff opinion. That is not a small detail. If there is an inspection report, then the public should know that. If there's not, then council approved the purchase based on a significant factual claim that was never really grounded in public record during the meeting. The resolution passed unanimously. Public Works then moved the landfill bridge discussion through second and third reading together because of time constraints tied to the project schedule. That also passed unanimously. Then in new business, Curtis Drive and North Spring Street both moved through the first reading with essentially no discussion, as you'd expect after the workshop in-depth discussion. Finance then ran through the supplementals, transfers, the then and now very quickly, and all those received 3 readings in one night without the emergency route. This is another useful process point. For routine finance housekeeping, handling all 3 readings in one meeting can make sense. It keeps the paper manageable without forcing council and staff to carry a stack of small budget cleanups across multiple meetings. And because they were not passed as emergencies, the normal referendum window still applies. Finally, the landfill note ordinance received first reading only, with second and third requested for April 2nd. The zoning cleanup item also received the first reading without discussion. Tolliver closed by thanking the police and sheriff's office for staffing for security at a large wrestling tournament at the high school a few weeks ago. The auditor's report was accepted and council adjourned. So, what's the real takeaway from this week? For me, it comes back to process. This was another meeting where the public would miss a lot if they only watched the 7 o'clock session. The workshop carried most of the explanations. The meeting carried all the votes. And the most important conversation of the night, recycling, did not appear as legislation at all. It appeared as framing, as a prepared case, as a narrowing of options before any formal decision is even on the agenda. That's where last week's episode 10 still matters here. Last week's special episode was about the March 9th Public Works Committee meeting because recycling and fluoride were moving fast enough to deserve a closer look. This week's workshop did not reopen that issue as much as extend the same pattern. More reasons to end the service, more skepticism toward the survey, more stress on cost and contamination. Very little sign that the city was seriously building out alternatives in public before moving toward elimination. I was reminded of that in a very ordinary way this week. A citizen stopped me at dinner and asked whether the AWS data center was basically a done deal, and if so, why council didn't just vote and move on. I told her what I think is the only honest answer. I do not know how council will vote, and there are still several process steps left. Site plan review at Planning Commission, the CRA, the development agreement at council. Nothing is a done deal until those steps are completed. What struck me was not her question by itself, it was what the question revealed, there is still a real public sense that some of these outcomes are already locked in before the remaining process is run. What council should not do is treat the remaining process like a formality. On AWS, there are still real steps left. Site plan review, the CRA, the development agreement. Those steps should be used to ask harder questions, push for the best version of the project possible, and if needed, re-examine the ordinances and make changes that improve the project before any final vote. Because right now, between the recycling discussion, referendum filing, and the questions people are still asking in everyday conversation, the message a lot of residents seem to be getting is that public input is heard, but not really taken seriously. That is a dangerous place for a city to be. And to that point, another piece of this broader process story moved. The referendum group submitted 1,529 signatures to the auditor's office, well above the 1,122 valid signatures they say were needed to qualify for the ballot. That referendum is about the zoning change tied to the potential data center parcels, not recycling. Obviously, the signatures still have to be certified, but barring any issue there, it appears the voters will likely decide the future zoning of the 4 parcels that council approved on February 19th. That's important because one of the patterns that keeps showing up in Wilmington right now is how quickly public opposition gets minimized when it becomes inconvenient. In the workshop, Crow discounted survey responses that represented almost 20% of Wilmington residents because the results did not support the direction he was arguing for on recycling. On the data center issue, repeated public comment has at times been brushed off as vocal minority. That framing gets easier to use when you're talking about the same 30 or 40 people showing up over and over again, but it's a lot harder to use when a petition drive turns in more than 1,500 signatures. That does not decide every policy question by itself, but what it does tell us is something important. This is not just a handful of loud people. When public concern shows up in repeated meeting comments and survey responses and now a petition filing that cleared the raw signature thresholds by hundreds, officials should stop acting like opposition is something to explain away. That is why process matters here. It matters how public input is treated. It matters whether alternatives are developed before a service is just written off. It matters whether staff comes in asking council to weigh options or asking council to just accept a conclusion. It matters whether officials approach opposition as something to learn from or something to manage around. Local government is more than just the roll call on the final vote. It's every step that leads up to that point. Public discussion, town halls, elected officials meeting with residents, listening carefully, asking better questions, and working toward better solutions. That is what local government should be about. And on March 19th, that was impossible to miss. That's the week in Wilmington. The next regular council meeting is Thursday, April 2nd. Thanks for listening. I'll see you then.